Cornelius Castoriadis was a Greek-French philosopher, social critic, economist, psychoanalyst, author of The Imaginary Institution of Society, and co-founder of the Socialisme Barbarie group. His writings on autonomy and social institutions have been influential in both academic and activist circles. Early life in Athens. Cornelius Castoriadis was born on March 11, 1922 in Constantinople, the son of Kyrgios and Sophia Castoriadis. His family had to move in July 1922 to Athens due to the Greek-Turkish population exchange. He developed an interest in politics after he came into contact with Marxist thought and philosophy at the age of 13. At the same time he began studying traditional philosophy after purchasing a copy of the book History of Philosophy by the historian of philosophy Nikolaos Louveris. Sometime between 1932 and 1935, Maximiani Porta was the French tutor of Castoriadis. During the same period, he attended the 8th Gymnasium of Athens in Katopatesia, from which he graduated in 1937. His first active involvement in politics occurred during the Metaxas regime, when he joined the Athenian Communist Youth, a section of the Young Communist League of Greece. In 1941 he joined the Communist Party of Greece, only to leave 1 year later in order to become an active Trotskyist. The latter action resulted in his persecution by both the Germans and the Communist Party. In 1944 he wrote his first essays on social science and Max Weber, which he published in a magazine named Archive of Sociology and Ethics. During the December 1944 violent clashes between the communist-led DLAS and the Papandreou government aided by British troops, Castoriadis heavily criticized the actions of the KKE. In December 1945, 3 years after earning a bachelor's degree in law, economics and political science from the School of Law, Economics and Political Sciences of the University of Athens, he got aboard the RMS Mataroa, a New Zealand ocean liner, to go to Paris to continue his studies under a scholarship offered by the French Institute of Athens. The same voyage, organized by Octave Merlier, also brought from Greece to France a number of other Greek writers, artists and intellectuals, including Constantine Andreou, Kostas Axelos, George Candelas, Costa Koulentianos, Emmanuel Kriaras, Adonis A. Pyro, Kostas Papayanous, and Virgil Solomonidis. Paris and leftist activity. Once in Paris, Castoriadis joined the Trotskyist Parti Comunista Internationalista. He and Claude Lefort constituted a «Chuli Montal tendency» in the French PCI in 1946. In 1948, they experienced their final disenchantment with Trotskyism, leading them to break away to found the libertarian socialist and councilist group and journal Socialisme Barbarie, which included Jean-François Lyotard and Guy Debord as members for a while, and profoundly influenced the French intellectual left. Castoriadis had links with the group around C.L. James until 1958. Also strongly influenced by Castoriadis and Socialisme Barbarie were the British group and journal Solidarity and Maurice Brinton. Early philosophical research. In the late 1940s, he started attending philosophical and sociological courses at the Faculty of Letters at the University of Paris, where among his teachers were Gaston Bachelard, the epistemologist René Poirier, the historian of philosophy Henri Breyer, Henri Gouaire, Jean Wahl, Gustave Guillaume, Albert Bayet, and Georges Davy. He submitted a proposal for a doctoral dissertation on mathematical logic to Poirier, but he eventually abandoned the project. The working title of his thesis was Introduction à la logique axiomatique. career as economist undistancing from Marxism. At the same time, he worked as an economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development until 1970, which was also the year when he obtained French citizenship. Consequently, his writings prior to that date were published pseudonymously as Pierre Tully, Paul Carton, Jean-Marc Caudray, etc. In his 1949 essay, The Relations of Production in Russia, Castoriadis developed a critique of the supposed socialist character of the government of the Soviet Union. The central claim of the Stalinist regime at the time was that the mode of production in Russia was socialist, but the mode of distribution was not yet a socialist one, since the socialist edification in the country had not yet been completed. However, according to Castoriadis' analysis, since the mode of distribution of the social product is inseparable from the mode of production, they claimed that one can have control over distribution while not having control over production is meaningless. Castoriadis was particularly influential in the turn of the intellectual left during the 1950s against the Soviet Union, because he argued that the Soviet Union was not a communist but rather a bureaucratic capitalist state, which contrasted with Western powers mostly by virtue of its centralized power apparatus. His work in the OECD substantially helped his analyses. In the latter years of Socialisme et Barbarie, Castoriadis came to reject the Marxist theories of economics and of history, especially in an essay on modern capitalism and revolution, Psychoanalyst. When Jacques Lacan's disputes with the International Psychoanalytical Association led to a split and the formation of the École Freudienne de Paris, in 1964, Castoriadis became a member. In 1968, Castoriadis married Pierre Algnier, a French psychoanalyst who had undergone psychoanalytic treatment under Jacques Lacan from 1955 until 1961. In 1969, Castoriadis and Algnier split from the EFP to join the Organisation Psychanalytique de Langue Française, the so-called Quatrime Group, a psychoanalytic group that claims to follow principles and methods that have opened up a third way between Lacanianism and the standards of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Castoriadis began to practice analysis in 1973. Philosopher of history and ontologist. In 1967, Castoriadis submitted a proposal for a doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of history to Paul Ricoeur. An epistolary dialogue began between them, but Ricoeur's obligations to the University of Chicago in the 1970s were such that the collaboration was not feasible at the time. The subject of his thesis would be Le fondement imaginaire du social history. In his 1975 work, L'Institution imaginaire de la société and in Les Carrefours du labyrinthe, published in 1978, Castoriadis began to develop his distinctive understanding of historical change as the emergence of irrecoverable otherness that must always be socially instituted and named in order to be recognized. Otherness emerges in part from the activity of the psyche itself, creating external social institutions that give stable form to what Castoriadis terms the magma of social significations, allows the psyche to create stable figures for the self, and to ignore the constant emergence of mental indeterminacy and ultra-T. For Castoriadis, self-examination, as in the ancient Greek tradition, could draw upon the resources of modern psychoanalysis. Autonomous individuals, the essence of an autonomous society, must continuously examine themselves and engage in critical reflection. He writes, Psychoanalysis can and should make a basic contribution to a politics of autonomy. Therefore, each person's self-understanding is a necessary condition for autonomy. One cannot have an autonomous society that would fail to turn back upon itself, that would not interrogate itself about its motives, its reasons for acting, its deep-seated tendencies. Considered in concrete terms, however, society doesn't exist outside the individuals making it up. The self-reflective activity of an autonomous society depends essentially upon the self-reflective activity of the humans who form that society. Castoriadis was not calling for every individual to undergo psychoanalysis per se. Rather, by reforming education and political systems, individuals would be increasingly capable of critical self and social reflection. He offers, if psychoanalytic practice has a political meaning, it is solely to the extent that it tries, as far as it possibly can, to render the individual autonomous, that is to say, lucid concerning her desire and concerning reality, and responsible for her acts, holding herself accountable for what she does. Sovietologist. In his 1980 Facing the War text, he took the view that Russia had become the primary world military power. To sustain this, in the context of the visible economic inferiority of the Soviet Union in the civilian sector, he proposed that the society may no longer be dominated by the party-state bureaucracy but by its stratocracy of separate and dominant military sector with expansionist designs on the world. He further argued that this meant there was no internal class dynamic which could lead to social revolution within Russian society, and that change could only occur through foreign intervention. Later life. In 1980, he joined the faculty of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales as Directeur d'études. He had been elected Directeur de Recherche in EHESS at the end of 1979 after submitting his previously published material in conjunction with a defense of his intellectual project of connecting the disciplines of history, sociology and economy through the concept of the social imaginary. His teaching career at the EHESS lasted 16 years. In 1980, he was also awarded his state doctorate from the University of Nanterre. The final title of his thesis under RICO was L'élément imaginaire d'histoire. In 1984, Castoriadis and Alagnier divorced. In 1989, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in social sciences by Panthéon University, and in 1993 another one in education sciences by the Democritus University of Thrace. He died on December 26, 1997 from complications following heart surgery. He was survived by Zoe Christophidi, his daughter Sparta, and Kaivelli, a younger daughter from his marriage with Zoe. He was known to intimates as Cornet. Thought. Edgar Morin proposed that Castoriadis' work will be remembered for its remarkable continuity and coherence as well as for its extraordinary breadth, which was encyclopedic in the original Greek sense, for it offered a paedia, or education, that brought full circle our cycle of otherwise compartmentalized knowledge in the arts and sciences. Castoriadis wrote essays on mathematics, physics, biology, anthropology, psychoanalysis, linguistics, society, economics, politics, philosophy, and art. One of Castoriadis' many important contributions to social theory was the idea that social change involves radical discontinuities that cannot be understood in terms of any determinate causes or presented as a sequence of events. Change emerges through the social imaginary without strict determinations, but in order to be socially recognized it must be instituted as revolution. Any knowledge of society and social change can exist only by referring to social imaginary significations. Thus, Castoriadis developed a conceptual framework where the sociological and philosophical category of the social imaginary has a central place, and he offered an interpretation of modernity centered on the principal categories of social institutions and social imaginary significations in his analysis. These categories are the product of the human faculties of the radical imagination and the social imaginary, the latter faculty being the collective dimension of the former. However, the social imaginary cannot be reduced or attributed to subjective imagination, since the individual is informed through an internalization of social significations. He used traditional terms as much as possible, though consistently redefining them. Further, some of his terminology changed throughout the later part of his career, with the terms gaining greater consistency but breaking from the traditional meaning. When reading Castoriadis, it is helpful to understand what he means by the terms he uses, since he does not redefine the terms in every piece where he employs them. Autonomy and heteronomy. The concept of autonomy appears to be a key theme in his early post-war writings, and he continued to elaborate on its meaning, applications and limits until his death, gaining him the title of philosopher of autonomy. The word itself is Greek, where auto means for, by itself, and nomos means law, defining the condition of creating one's own laws, whether as an individual or as a whole society. Castoriadis noticed that while all societies construct their own unique laws and institutions, members of autonomous societies are fully aware of this fact and explicitly self-institute. In contrast, members of heteronymous societies delegate this process to extra-social authorities and attribute their imaginaries to gods or ancestors or, in modern ideologies, to historical necessity. Castoriadis emphasized the need of societies to legitimize the laws, or explain, in other words, why the laws are good and just as they claim them to be. Most traditional societies did that through religion, believing that the laws were given by a supernatural ancestor, a god, and therefore must be true. Modern capitalist societies legitimize the system through reason, claiming it makes logical sense. Castoriadis observes that nearly all such efforts are tautological in that they legitimize the system through rules defined by the system itself. So just like the Old Testament and the Quran claim that there is only one God, capitalism first defines logic as the maximization of utility and minimization of cost, and then bases its own legitimacy on its effectiveness to meet this criterion. As he explains in one of his lectures in the Greek village of Leonidio in 1984, many newly founded societies start from an autonomous state which is usually in the form of direct democracy, like the town hall meetings during the American Revolution and the local assemblies of the Paris Commune. What they end up with, however, is a form of governance by which the citizens do not legislate directly but delegate this power to a group of experts who remain in power, largely unchecked by official means, for a number of years. The ancient Greeks, on the other hand, developed a system of continuous autonomy where the people voted constantly on matters of government and law, and where the elected rulers, the archons, were mainly asked to enforce them. In such a system, courts of law were governed by common citizens who were appointed to the degree of judge briefly, and army generals were voted in by the people and had to convince them of the correctness of the decisions. Taking some poetic license to expand this point, he says that in this system, the president of the national treasury could have been a Phoenician slave, since he would only be asked to implement the rulings of the demos. Castoriadis' writings delve at length into the philosophy and politics of the ancient Greeks who, as a true autonomous society, knew that laws are man-made and legitimization tautological. They challenged these laws on a constant basis and yet obeyed them to the same degree, proving that autonomous societies can indeed exist. The imaginary. The term "the imaginary" originates in the writings of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan and is strongly associated with Castoriadis' work. To understand it better, we might think of its usual context, the imaginary institution of societies. By that, Castoriadis means that societies, together with the laws and legalizations, are founded upon a basic conception of the world and man's place in it. Traditional societies had elaborate imaginaries, expressed through various creation myths, by which they explained how the world came to be and how it is sustained. Capitalism did away with this mythic imaginary by replacing it with what it claims to be pure reason. That same imaginary is, interestingly enough, the foundation of its opposing ideology, communism. By that measure, he observes, first in his main criticism of Marxism, titled The Imaginary Institution of Society, as well as speaking in Brussels, that these two systems are more closely related than was previously thought, since they share the same industrial revolution type imaginary, that of a rational society where man's welfare is materially measurable and infinitely improvable through the expansion of industries and advancements in science. In this respect, Marx failed to understand that technology is not, as he claimed, the main drive of social change, since we have historical examples where societies possessing near identical technologies formed very different relations to them. An example given in the book is France and England during the Industrial Revolution, with the second being much more liberal than the first. Similarly, in the issue of ecology, he observes that the problems facing our environment are only present within the capitalist imaginary that values the continuous expansion of industries. Trying to solve it by changing and managing these industries better might fail, since it essentially acknowledges this imaginary as real, thus perpetuating the problem. Thus, imaginaries are directly responsible for all aspects of culture. The Greeks had an imaginary by which the world stems from chaos, and the ancient Jews an imaginary by which the world stems from the will of a pre-existing entity, God. The former developed therefore a system of immediate democracy where the laws were ever changing according to the people's will, while the second a theocratic system according to which man is in an eternal quest to understand and enforce the will of God. Castoriadis also believed that the complex historical processes through which new imaginaries are born are not directly quantifiable by science. This is because it is through the imaginaries themselves that the categories upon which science is applied are created. In the second part of his imaginary institution of society, he gives the example of set theory, which is at the basis of formal logic, which cannot function without having first defined the elements which are to be assigned to sets. This initial schema of separation of the world into distinct elements and categories therefore precedes the application of logic and, consequently, science. Chaos. The concept of chaos that one encounters frequently in Castoriadis' work. According to that, the Greeks developed an imaginary by which the world is a product of chaos, as narrated by both Homer and Hesiod. The word has since been promoted to a scientific term, but Castoriadis is inclined to believe that although the Greeks had sometimes expressed chaos in that way, they mainly referred to it as nothingness. He then concludes what made the ancient Greek society different to other societies is exactly that core imaginary, which essentially says that if the world is created out of nothing, then man can indeed, in his brief time on earth, model it as he sees fit, without trying to conform on some pre-existing order like a divine law. He contrasted that sharply to the biblical imaginary, which sustains all Judaic societies to this day, according to which, in the beginning of the world there was a God, a willing entity, and man's position therefore is to understand that will and act accordingly. The ancient Greeks and the modern West Castoriadis views the political organization of the ancient Greek city-states as a model of an autonomous society. He argues that their direct democracy was not based, as many assume, on the existence of slaves and/or the geography of Greece, which forced the creation of small city-states, since many other societies had these preconditions but did not create democratic systems. The same goes for colonization, since the neighboring Phoenicians, who had a similar expansion in the Mediterranean, were monarchical till their end. During this time of colonization, however, around the time of Homer's epic poems, we observe for the first time that the Greeks, instead of transferring the mother city's social system to the newly established colony, instead, for the first time in known history, legislate anew from the ground up. What also made the Greeks special was the fact that, following the above, they kept this system as a perpetual autonomy which led to direct democracy. This phenomenon of autonomy is again present in the emergence of the states of northern Italy during the Renaissance, again as a product of small independent merchants. He sees a tension in the modern West between, on the one hand, the potentials for autonomy and creativity and the proliferation of open societies, and, on the other hand, the spirit-crushing force of capitalism. These are respectively characterized as the creative imaginary and the capitalist imaginary. I think that we are at a crossing in the roads of history in the grand sense. One road already appears clearly laid out, at least in its general orientation. That's the road of the loss of meaning, of the repetition of empty forms, of conformism, apathy, irresponsibility, and cynicism at the same time as it is that of the tightening grip of the capitalist imaginary of unlimited expansion, of rational mastery, pseudo-mastery, of an unlimited expansion of consumption for the sake of consumption, that is to say, for nothing, and of a techno-science that has become autonomized along its path and that is evidently involved in the domination of this capitalist imaginary. The other road should be opened. It is not at all laid out. It can be opened only through a social and political awakening, a resurgence of the project of individual and collective autonomy, that is to say, of the will to freedom. This would require an awakening of the imagination and of the creative imaginary. He argues that, in the last 2 centuries, ideas about autonomy again come to the fore. This extraordinary profusion reaches a sort of pinnacle during the 2 centuries stretching between 1750 and 1950. This is a very specific period, because of the very great density of cultural creation but also because of its very strong subversiveness. Lasting influence. Castoriadis has influenced European thought in important ways. His interventions in sociological and political theory have resulted in some of the most well-known writing to emerge from the continent. Hans Joas published a number of articles in American journals in order to highlight the importance of Castoriadis' work to a North American sociological audience, and Johann Paul Arnason has been of enduring importance both for his critical engagement with Castoriadis' thought and for his sustained efforts to introduce it to the English-speaking public. In the last few years, there has been growing interest in Castoriadis' thought, including the publication of 2 monographs authored by Arnason's former students, Jeff Kluger's Castoriadis, Psyche, Society, Autonomy, and Susie Adams's Castoriadis' Ontology, Being and Creation.